There comes a time in life when everything that seems solid begins to dissolve in silence. One ordinary day, perhaps waking up earlier than usual or looking at your reflection in the mirror, something changes. A small, nagging doubt whispers in the back of your mind. Do I really believe that? Or have I just got used to repeating it? This seemingly simple question has the power to shake decades of certainties, challenge family traditions, and expose wounds that have long been covered by rituals and automatic prayers. For many men between the ages of 30 and 50, this phase is like an invisible portal. You carry the weight of expectations on your shoulders, to be strong, to be a provider, to be an example, to be firm. Faith often comes into this package as another pillar that must remain unshaken, no matter what happens. But time passes, losses accumulate, and life, with its rawness, teaches us that no certainty is eternal. It's at this point that discomfort arises. The faith that used to welcome now charges, judges, and threatens. What used to be a refuge begins to seem like an emotional prison, and spirituality, which should free, suffocates with invisible demands. But the problem is not faith itself. The real impasse lies in the origin of this faith. Was it born out of a deep living experience, or was it planted by repetition, fear, and the need to belong? Few people talk about it. Questioning religion is still taboo. It still sounds like rebellion, ingratitude, or even a sin. But what if the opposite is true? What if doubting is the first step towards a more sincere, more mature, more human faith? Psychology has long tried to understand this phenomenon. Freud saw religion as a collective illusion, an infantile desire for protection. Jung, on the other hand, saw it as a necessary symbol for the soul to find balance. Between these two extremes, radical criticism and symbolic acceptance, there is a fertile space for reflection. A space where faith and reason can converse, where the individual ceases to be an automatic follower and becomes the protagonist of their own spiritual quest. This text is an invitation to that space. Over the next few chapters, we will walk this fine line between faith and control, between belief and conditioning. We will explore the role of religion in the construction of identity, the emotional mechanisms behind blind obedience, and the fear that often lurks behind religious fervor. But this is not about attacking religion. On the contrary, the aim here is to clean the lens, remove the excesses, and perhaps rediscover, amidst the rubble, a faith that breathes, that welcomes, that doesn't need to shout to exist. If you've ever felt suffocated by commandments you don't understand, guilty about doubts you didn't choose to have, or disconnected from a God who seems increasingly distant, this is your place. There are no ready-made answers here, but there are honest questions. And sometimes, that's all the soul needs to begin to awaken. It all begins almost imperceptibly. A strange feeling during a prayer. A sentence in the sermon that sounds forced. A silence that no longer seems sacred, but empty. Gradually, what used to be certainty turns into discomfort. It's not an immediate rupture. There's no shouting or revolt. It's a discreet, internal, silent crack. And the most curious thing, this discomfort doesn't come from the absence of faith, but from doubt about its origin. Does what I believe really come from me? Or is it an idea that I have inherited, accepted, and never dared to question? This discomfort usually manifests itself more strongly in phases of transition or crisis. The loss of a loved one, family problems, an unexpected illness, career changes. It's as if the ground beneath our feet has been ripped out, and we instinctively look for support in the structures that have always been there. Family, friends, and of course, faith. But sometimes that faith no longer sustains you as it used to. You repeat the same gestures, the same words, but relief doesn't come. And what was supposed to be a reunion with something greater turns into a kind of intimate theater, where you pretend to believe as you did before, but you know that something has changed. For many men, admitting this discomfort is almost impossible. There is an unconscious association between faith and moral masculinity. A man of faith is seen as someone who is firm, guided, and respectable. Saying that you no longer feel that connection with religion can sound like weakness, like a loss of internal structure. This is why discomfort is often camouflaged by routine, work, consumption, or even cynicism. But it's still there, ruminating in the back of the mind, waiting for the right moment to emerge with force. This is when difficult questions arise. Do I believe because I really feel something spiritual, or because I was told it was the right thing to do? How many parts of my identity have been shaped by doctrines I never consciously chose? What would happen if I stopped obeying? The fear of thinking these things already shows how much we have been conditioned not to touch these subjects. And this is where the deeper psychological dimension of faith comes in. From childhood, we are taught to trust authority figures, parents, teachers, spiritual leaders. This is natural. But this pattern automatically extends to the spiritual realm. Often we don't develop an individual and authentic faith, but an emotional obedience to a structure that provides comfort and also control. Religion, in this context, offers easy answers to complex questions. And for a tired, insecure, or wounded mind, this can be tempting. Accepting ready-made rules is much easier than building your own path. The discomfort arises precisely when the soul begins to seek this path. When man begins to long for a faith that is his own, not inherited. And that's when everything can change. Because discomfort is actually the first sign of freedom. It's the beginning of the process of spiritual maturation, where faith stops being an imposed stick and starts to become a personal, honest journey. Perhaps quieter, but infinitely more real. This transition, however, requires courage. You have to look inwards and accept that some beliefs may have only served as armor. Some certainties may never have really been yours. And that there is a deep fear. Fear of divine abandonment, of family rejection, of existential emptiness, that needs to be faced head-on. But in doing so, man comes closer to what is most rare and valuable. A living faith, born of confrontation, doubt, pain, and precisely because of this, it carries truth. The human mind is both extraordinary and vulnerable. From an early age, it searches for patterns, answers, and security amid the chaos of existence. It's natural. A child isn't born with the structure to face the uncertainty of the world. That's why they observe, learn, and internalize what comes from the adults around them. When it comes to religion, this process is even more delicate. What presents itself as faith is often just a reflection of deep emotional conditioning, and rarely conscious. Think for a moment about how you learned to pray. It was probably an adult who taught you. Perhaps your mother or father, with the best of intentions, presented prayer as a link to the sacred. But along with the words came associated feelings. Fear of making mistakes, expectation of reward, the idea that God watches, judges, approves, or punishes. Even before you developed critical thinking, you had already absorbed invisible codes about right and wrong, about what pleases God and what leads to punishment. Psychology calls this belief formation by emotional authority. The child doesn't question. They believe because they trust. But what was natural in childhood becomes a problem when faith remains stuck in these automatic mechanisms in adulthood. When a 40-year-old man still fears thinking heresies because he feels guilty, we are dealing with a conditioned belief, not a chosen one. This conditioning doesn't just happen through the family. School, the religious environment, the speeches of spiritual leaders, all contribute to reinforcing patterns that are repeated until they become part of the identity. Belief begins to function as a closed system, where doubt is not welcome. Questioning is a sign of weakness or deviation. And the more rigid the structure, the harder it is for the individual to realize that they are repeating ideas that may no longer represent who they have become. The curious thing is that the more emotionally involved the belief, the more it resists rational thought. The brain, in self-defense, activates mechanisms such as cognitive dissonance, trying to ignore information that contradicts what has already been established. This explains why so many people react angrily when their religious convictions are questioned. It's not just a difference of opinion. It's a threat to the emotional basis that sustains identity. What's more, many religions operate on the basis of double dependency, emotional and social. Conditioned faith not only defines what you should think, but also where you belong. Community, family, friends, everything revolves around the common belief. Questioning means risking rejection. And as social human beings, we're afraid of that. Sometimes it's easier to continue obeying in silence than to deal with the abyss of loneliness. But there's a crucial point. True spirituality only flourishes when it goes beyond conditioning. When it stops being an automatic response and becomes the fruit of experience, reflection, and choice. This doesn't mean abandoning faith, but reformulating it, freeing it from the shackles of fear, guilt, and control disguised as love. A faith born of conditioning serves the structure that sustains it more than the individual who practices it. Jung said that modern man is no longer capable of simply believing. He needs to experience the sacred. And this experience requires the courage to disengage from the masses, to tear up old emotional contracts and embark on a solitary quest. It's a painful process, yes, but also liberating. Because when you begin to realize that many of your beliefs have been programmed, not felt, something inside you moves. A new space opens up. A space where you can breathe and begin to build a spirituality that makes sense with who you really are today. If there is a silent but powerful force that shapes religious behavior throughout life, it is guilt. It's an often invisible but constant feeling that sets in not just as a reaction to a mistake made, but as an anticipation of a mistake not made at all. In the field of spirituality, guilt is mixed with the idea of sin, divine vigilance, and eternal damnation, creating an atmosphere of obedience that paralyzes the spirit and conditions even the most intimate thoughts. From an early age, we learn that God is watching. He sees everything, including what no one else sees, our desires, our doubts, our intentions. This, which could be interpreted as a loving and welcoming presence, often becomes a source of fear. A fear that has no face, but which manifests itself every time we think about questioning a dogma, following our own path, or even recognizing that we no longer feel the same faith as before. This fear has many names. Fear of offending God, of going to hell, of being rejected by the community, of losing salvation. It doesn't need to be verbalized to be effective. It's embedded in simple phrases like, "Be careful what you think," or "God punishes." And what begins as subtle moral guidance becomes, over the years, a system of internal surveillance that prevents freedom of conscience. Since obeying can be safer than thinking, many prefer to stifle their concerns, put on the mask of obedient faith, and keep repeating the practices, even when there is no longer any connection. This system is strengthened because religion, when used as an instrument of emotional control, directly associates doubt with guilt. Questioning is a lack of faith. Feeling distant from God is a sign of sin. Thinking differently is a risk of condemnation. The result is an obedience based on fear, not love or spiritual experience. An obedience that doesn't draw near but pushes away. It doesn't heal, but silently sickens. There is also another essential element in this equation: shame. While guilt focuses on transgression, shame attacks personal value. It's not just, "I did wrong," but "I am wrong." And when this shame is nurtured within religious contexts, it slowly destroys self-esteem. Men who grow up hearing that their desires, thoughts, or doubts are dirty or unworthy begin to distrust themselves. They come to see their own interiority as an enemy, as impure territory that needs to be tamed at any cost. This internal fragmentation generates suffering. Many experience silent conflicts between what they feel and what they have been taught to believe. They long for freedom but fear punishment. They seek authenticity but can't bear the thought of disappointing the divine figure that has been imposed on them. And so they live trapped between two worlds, that of a conditioned faith that no longer makes sense, and that of a frightening emptiness. This emotional limbo is not spiritual weakness. It's a clear sign that something needs to be revised. When faith is based on fear and guilt, it becomes toxic. It can even produce right behavior, but at the expense of emotional integrity. Obedience imposed out of fear does not transform. At most, it suffocates. What's worse, it can fuel judgment, intolerance, and feelings of moral superiority. After all, those who constantly sacrifice themselves to please God tend to expect the same from others, and to condemn them when they don't do the same. But there is another way. Spirituality doesn't have to be based on guilt. It can be a journey of reconciliation with one's own humanity. Understanding that making mistakes is part of the process. That questioning is a sign of intelligence, not rebellion. That God, if he exists in a living and true way, is not offended by sincere doubts, but by the hypocrisy of those who repeat empty words just to keep up appearances. The first step towards liberation is to see this invisible weight. Name the guilt, the fear, the shame, and realize that they have been taught, cultivated, and reinforced. They are not part of the soul. They are just layers that cover it. And when they begin to be removed, even if slowly, a new horizon reveals itself. A horizon where faith can flourish again, not as a duty, but as a choice. Not as submission, but as a living relationship with something greater. Behind the intimate experience of faith, which many experience as consolation, strength, or inspiration, there is a much larger structure, historically constructed with an almost political precision. It's important to recognize this. Not every religion is just an expression of the sacred. In many cases, it is also a system. And like any system, it has rules, hierarchies, punishments, and rewards. So when we talk about faith, we're not just dealing with the spiritual, but also with something deeply institutional, and, in many cases, strategic. Since ancient times, religion has been a powerful tool for social organization. Not only in the positive sense of bringing people together around common values, but also as a means of exercising control over behavior, decisions, and even thoughts. Entire empires were sustained by religious doctrines. Kings were anointed by God. Wars were fought in the name of faith. And the more centralized the spiritual authority, the more efficient the control over bodies and consciences. This structure manifests itself through dogmas, absolute truths that cannot be questioned. When a doctrine sets itself up as the only way to salvation, it closes the door to dialogue, doubt, and freedom of conscience. If you're in, you're safe. If you leave, you're lost. It's a simple but extremely effective mechanism. After all, who dares to disagree when the price is eternal damnation? And it's not just about ideas. Religious institutions also build a logic of power that is sustained by the repetition of roles and rituals. There is the spiritual leader, the priest, the pastor, the guide, who interprets the sacred texts and dictates what is right and wrong. There is the believer, who listens, obeys, and complies. This vertical model hinders the development of a mature faith, because it shifts authority from personal experience to an intermediary. Man ceases to connect directly with the divine and begins to depend on the approval of another man in order to feel worthy. In many traditions, this dependence is reinforced with rigid rules about behavior, sexuality, family, dress, and even thought. The discourse is always the same. It's for your own good. But deep down, it's an effective way of keeping the flock together, submissive and predictable. The sheep and shepherd logic is comfortable for those in charge. It keeps the flow of power concentrated, authority unchallenged, and the system intact. What's more, the fear of hell, the guilt of sin, and the hope of salvation are the perfect pillars to support this edifice. Instead of using these feelings as a starting point for reflection, many institutions turn them into fuel for obedience. The man who fears burning eternally is easier to control, and the more frightened he is, the more he will depend on rituals, tithes, confessions, vows of silence, all mechanisms that reinforce the structure of domination disguised as spirituality. The truth is that for many, following the rules of religion is more comfortable than taking responsibility for their own spiritual life. There is security in, do this and God will accept you. The problem arises when this comfort becomes a prison. When man realizes that his faith is no longer his own, but that of the institution that shaped him. And then comes the question, how do I regain control of my own spirituality without breaking with everything that has given me structure so far? The answer lies in recognizing the difference between structure and essence. Institutionalized religion can offer useful tools, texts, stories, symbols, rituals. But when these tools come to dictate existence, instead of serving the inner journey, something is reversed. Spirituality becomes control. And man, who sought freedom, finds himself shackled by promises that no longer make sense. This realization, although painful, can be the beginning of an internal revolution. Because by realizing the structure, it is possible to reposition oneself within it, or outside of it. It's possible to regain autonomy, seek direct experiences with the sacred, and rebuild a relationship with God, or with the mystery of existence, without having to obey ready-made maps. Institutional religion can be a starting point, but never the final destination. There is a kind of faith that doesn't shout, demand, or impose. A faith that doesn't come from repetition, but from silence. It doesn't come from obedience, but from listening. One that doesn't weigh you down, but frees you. When you walk the journey of spiritual deconstruction, going through discomfort, questioning conditioning, facing fear and seeing the structure of control, something very profound happens. The inner space that was previously occupied by rules begins to open up to authentic experiences. It's the beginning of a new form of faith, no longer as a duty, but as a conscious choice. This transformation doesn't mean rejecting everything that came before. On the contrary, it means purifying, separating what is essential from what is excess, recognizing that, in the midst of so much conditioning, there were also seeds of truth, sincere gestures, words that touched, silences that welcomed. The difference is that now, with emotional maturity and autonomy, you can choose what remains. Faith is built from the inside out, without fear, without guilt, without needing approval. This new spirituality is intimate. It doesn't need an audience. It happens in silent conversation with your own conscience, in the contemplation of something greater that you may never be able to name, but that you feel. It's in simple gestures, in full presence, in accepting who you are, with all your doubts, flaws, and contradictions. And that is precisely where the sacred lies. Not in fixed dogmas, but in the living flow of experience. Not in external impositions, but in the deep connection with what is most authentic in you. To find this free faith is to rediscover your own humanity. It means understanding that there is no single path to the divine, that each journey is unique, that mistakes don't keep God away, but the fear of making mistakes can keep us away from ourselves. That spirituality is not absolute purity, but constant reconciliation. That the divine presence, if it exists, is not only in the temples, but also in the tired body, in the contained tear, in the true embrace, in the welcoming silence. This spiritual freedom is not easy. It requires responsibility, because without a ready-made manual, you need to become the architect of your own faith. You need to listen more than speak, feel more than repeat. You have to be willing to live in a space where there are no guarantees, only presence. But what you gain is immense. Peace, integration, truth. A living, pulsating, breathing faith because it's finally yours. Looking back, you may realize that everything you've lived through, the rules, the fears, the conflicts, were stages. And without them, you wouldn't have gotten here. That's the paradox. Even imposed faith at some point can be the stepping stone to authentic faith. The important thing is not to stop halfway. It's to keep walking, even if you don't have all the answers. Because sometimes the most sacred thing is not to know, but to keep searching with an open heart. If this content has touched you in any way, if it has brought clarity, or if it has simply opened up a space for more honest reflection on your own spiritual journey, I invite you to like this video and subscribe to the channel. This helps to strengthen this community of people who think, feel, and seek something true amidst the noise. And if you want to contribute to this work in a more direct way, consider leaving a support of any amount. Just click on the button below. Your help strengthens this work and allows more content like this to reach more people, especially those who may still be trapped in fear, guilt, or silence, unaware that there is another way. Faith, when free, doesn't need to be imposed. It simply flourishes. And if this text has helped you to see that, it's worth the journey.